In this video, I want to demonstrate and maybe even introduce you to one of my favorite features of the Python programming language, and that is list comprehensions. List comprehensions are basically a way that we can take a for loop that results in a list and write it as a one-liner. You'll see what I mean. What I've got here as our particular application is a bunch of distances here. These are distances of US cities from LAX, from Los Angeles Regional Airport. All of these distances right now are in miles. They're inside of a list, right? And I want to modify each and every one of these quantities in a consistent way. I want to take each of these quantities measured in miles and turn them into kilometers. And I want to show you how we can do this with both a regular for loop, kind of a traditional approach, an approach that you might use when you're new to Python and starting out, and also with a list comprehension. Now, there's some other ways that would be even easier than this that I'm not going to touch on. I really just want to focus on the syntax of list comprehensions. So writing this as a for loop and then translating that for loop into a list comprehension, I think will help us really wrap our head around at least the basic version of this Python functionality. So what we're going to do is we're going to write a function here, and that function is going to change miles to kilometers, and it's going to take in a list of miles. We'll call it miles list. As you're starting out, learning about lists, learning about for loops, etc., you might do something like this. You'll say, hey, let's make a new blank or empty list, okay? And then let's loop over the old list. So for each distance in in miles list, right? Because this is the list that is getting passed into the function, right? So it's getting this distance miles is going to get renamed miles list. And then inside of this for loop, we're going to say what we want to happen to each of those individual distances. Well, what I want to happen is I want to take each distance and multiply it by, I looked this up beforehand, 1.60934. And that'll change each of these quantities from miles to kilometers. A mile is about 1.6 times bigger than a kilometer. So once you've done that, we want to take these new kilometer values and put them inside of kilometers list. We'll do that by appending them to the list. Append is going to insert each of these as this for loop runs. Each distance, new distance, the kilometers distance, is going to get shoved into this list one by one. Okay? So once this for loop is done running, we then want to return that kilometers list. Okay? Let's see if we've got it working right. So we'll print miles to kilometers, passing in our distances in miles. And yeah, let's see what that does. However, distances miles has not been created in my notebook yet. If you look at this first cell, there's no execution count here on the top left. So if I hit play there, okay, the execution count is now 1, so that list now exists in my notebook's memory. So we should be good to go now. Now I'll run this function. We'll print out its result. Looks pretty good. Those are the distances in kilometers. And we've got these decimal places after each one because of the precision that we used here when we made our calculation. In fact, just for simplicity's sake, to make this look a little bit prettier, let's round each of these to the nearest whole number. Okay? There we go. Each of those has now been rounded to the nearest whole number. Cool. Now I want to take the same thing. I want to do it all over again, but we're going to do it using a list comprehension this time. For a list comprehension, instead of starting off creating an empty list, I should start off with 2 square brackets. These 2 square brackets say, hey, whatever happens to the expression inside of here, when all is said and done, it's going to be a list. We're going to make it a list at the end. I like to think of the square brackets here as if we were, starting to make an empty list, even though that's not quite technically exactly what we're doing. Then I put inside of the square brackets what I want to happen to each of the items that my for loop is affecting, because you're going to see that this list comprehension essentially is a for loop and appending all in one, and it can do some other things too. Okay? But what is it we want to happen? Well, we want to put all of these rounded kilometer distances. That's what we want to happen to each item in the list that we want to affect. And then that goes on the left side of my expression. And on the right side of my expression, what do I put? Well, I just put the first line of the for loop, not including the colon. Leave the colon off. And that's my list comprehension. It's done. This is actually everything I need. So I can return that list comprehension. And this is equivalent to the function I wrote above, but it's in one single line. And in fact, it's in one still quite readable line. I'm saying, right, for each distance in the miles list that's coming in here, what do I want done? Well, take each of those distances and do this to it. Take each item in the incoming list, modify each of those items in this way, and then make the final result, once you modified all those items, put it inside a list, those square brackets at the beginning and end. Okay. So just as a little comment here, I'm going to say the left side is what we want to happen to each item. And then the right side is literally just the first line of our for loop. We can return that all at once. Let's see if this does the same thing or if I've got a typo somewhere. There we go. Looks good. Now, there are other things you can do with for loops. You can add if statements and conditionals. I'm not particularly a fan of that because some of the readability of this expression goes down when we do that. But if you ever have a list and you just say to yourself, I want to modify each item in this list in a consistent way, and you find yourself going this route, I hope you would pause and say, maybe I could use a list comprehension here. Maybe I can make my code more concise while still maintaining a high amount of readability with this really cool feature of the Python language.